Thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this very good conference. First of all, I will briefly outline the historical background because I'm pretty sure that not everyone is familiar with the Holocaust in Hungary. So basically, anti-Jewish laws were brought from the end of the 1930s, and these curtailed the rights of Jews to take part in economic and intellectual life. And during the war years, an unarmed military labor service was introduced for Jewish men, which meant also that women and elderly and the children remained at home alone. Now, Nazi Germany occupied Hungary in March 1944, which accelerated anti-Jewish persecution. From April, ghettoization started, and the 15th of May, the first deporting trains departed from Hungary to Auschwitz-Birkenau. From mid-May until the 8th of July, more than 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Basically, the entire rural Jewish population disappeared from the country, and only the Jews of Budapest remained in Hungary. As men were in military labor service, mainly women, the children, and elderly or sick people were taken to Auschwitz, which also meant that 75 to 80% of them were murdered immediately upon arrival. After the war, approximately 200 to 250,000 Holocaust survivors lived in Hungary. And even though, according to law, they were entitled to restitution, the government did not initiate a comprehensive restitution program for them. Therefore, most of the survivors had to turn to international or self-aid organizations, such as, for instance, Joint or the World Jewish Congress. From 1948/49, state socialism started, and restitution was completely withheld during the socialist period, whereas also the Holocaust was replaced with an the narrative of an anti-fascist struggle, which also meant that the new regime did not take responsibility for the actions of the governments during the Holocaust. And I will now talk a little bit about the background, the historical and diplomatic background of the compensation from West Germany, which was unique in Hungary. So already at the time of taking power, the Hungarian Communist Party started negotiations for German compensation. The most important aim was, of course, to bring foreign currency in Hungary. And the BEG and Brugg laws, I'm not going to pronounce them, sorry. They made compensation possible in West Germany. However, since West Germany did not have diplomatic relations with countries which acknowledged Germany, this of course included Hungary, the survivors living in these states were excluded from West German compensation. Still, the Hungarian state initiated the establishment of NUÉSZ, which is called Nácizmus Magyarországi Üldözöttjének Országos Érdekvédelmi Szervezete in Hungarian. This means National Committee of Persons Persecuted by Nazism. And this association, the most important aim was to continue negotiations for compensation from West Germany. And yes, not only the influx of foreign currency would have been desirable, but also to get back properties which were taken abroad to the territory of Germany during the war. And finally, due to these diplomatic efforts and Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, this process was speeded up. And in 1960, the first compensation program reached Hungary. Now, this was initiated in 1951. And it was a compensation for the victims of Nazi medical experiments. And in this framework, 5 million marks were paid to Hungarian survivors. In fact, the mere fact that this compensation program reached Hungary was considered a diplomatic success. And here is one page from the sources with which I worked during my research. So this compensation program was coordinated in Hungary by NUIES, the aforementioned organization, the Hungarian Red Cross, and the Center for Financial Institutions, which represented the state in the whole process. Now, these applications, which the victims of medical experiments handed in, are very complex, and therefore they constitute a very rich source base. Because first of all, they had to fill in a long questionnaire which contained basic data about their pre-war life, the experiences during the Holocaust, and also their post-war situation. There were also protocols written where the claimants had to tell their story with their own words. However, we can infer from the descriptions that these testimonies were influenced by directed questions. And of course, these claims also contain additional paperwork, such as medical documents, documents from the International Tracing Service, medical examinations conducted by independent doctors, and sometimes also witnesses were invited to give testimonies. The applications were sent to Geneva, to Switzerland, and there a committee of the International Red Cross evaluated them. And this contained also independent experts. And these procedures often took years. So the successful applicants received the compensation years later after they handed in their application. In case someone was successful, they could receive up to 30 or 40,000 marks. And there were many others who handed in claims, but were not considered successful. They also received smaller sums from NUIES. I also have to mention that this money was changed centrally by the state with very low rates. So the state kind of profiteered on these sums. And I found statistics from 1971, according to which there were 1,047 applicants. Approximately 400 of these applications were adequately documented and supported by the organizations. In 257 cases, they could not find a connection between the experiment and the health damage. And 400 cases were not processed or had other issues, such as, for instance, the claimant passed away in the meantime, or he or she emigrated. And here comes the gendered aspect of this whole research, because I investigated first and foremost applicants who lived in Pest County, which is the central county around Budapest. And out of 42 of them, 38 were women, and at least 30 were sterilized or they became infertile during their camp experience. And now I will analyze 3 cases. The first one is that of Mrs. Dezső J. She was born in 1903 in Pest-Szent-Erzsébet, and here is a quote from her testimony from her file. From the spring of 1944, I worked at the Lér war plant in Pest-Erzsébet. In November 1944, I was taken to the train station at Józsefváros. There, I was put on a train and taken directly to Ravensbrück. I was accommodated in a large tent where we were squeezed together like herrings on the stone floor. Some days later, we were taken to the bath where all my clothes and valuables were taken away. And a month later, she was taken to Penig, and she came back to Hungary in June 1945. She applied for compensation in 1962, and according to her testimony, she was subjected to an experiment performed by a man in a white cloak on an operating table, and something cold was injected in her womb. Afterwards, she had bellyache and cramps, and she also added, quote, I spent a month in Ravensbrück, and I know that the intervention was repeated in the same way once more. And there are 2 quotes from her file. The first one states, Mrs. Dezső J.'s husband died in the Eastern Front as a military laborer. Mrs. Dezső J. moved to her brother after the liberation and lived there until she got married. She could not get a job until 1957 due to her health. Her husband supported her. And in her testimony, she said, "During my deportation, I did not menstruate. Thus, I received injections after I got home, but my period returned only 4 or 5 months later. I got married again in 1945. However, unfortunately, I could not have a family, as in May 1946, my pregnancy had to be aborted in the 2nd or 3rd month. Then I got pregnant in summer again, but in October, I had an abortion again, and I could not get pregnant ever since." She also had current health issues such as bellyache and waist ache, and she also had bad nerves. So we could say that this is a kind of typical story to Hungary, at least. Her husband was a military laborer, she was deported, and she was in a very vulnerable position without her family, and she was subjected to sterilization. We also know, 5 minutes? Really? How did time go? Really? Okay. So after the war, she could not have children. Her femininity was ruined, and this also had psychological consequences, and her health issues also undermined restarting her life. So the Holocaust and her experience during the Holocaust affected her life even years after the liberation. In 1969, she received 30,000 marks, which was changed to 224,775 forints. The second case is that of Ilona W. She lived in Pilis with her pensioner parents and her siblings. And on the 19th of March, 1944, her father was arrested. Ilona had just arrived back home after an appendix operation, and this is what she stated in her testimony. "I was not in a transportable condition, thus I remained in Pilis until April 1944. The local gendarmerie took me to the doctor in April. Even though my wound was still open, they dragged me to the Kistarcsa internment camp and from there to Auschwitz-Birkenau. After the liberation, she returned home, and in 1950 she got married. And she had a son. However, she got divorced in 1960. And this is what she said about her experience in the camps. "From time to time, my wound scarred over, other times it oozed. During a selection with other young women, I was taken to the house with geraniums in quotation marks, which was a brothel. In this house, my appendix wound opened up again. Thus, I had a medical examination and received injections of various colors. After Mengele selected me, I was taken to the barrack of experiments. I was operated again. They put something in the wound and it was plastered. And she was under medical treatment ever since she returned home and had various symptoms, of course, and she was unable to work for a long time. Unfortunately, we know from Robert Zammer's research that none of the sex slaves of the brothel in Auschwitz were Hungarians, and also the SS did not choose Jews for these positions, let's put it this way. Thus, this detail was definitely made up in Ilona's compensation claim, probably to make her experiences seem even more grave. And since many Hungarian survivors did not get restitution after the war, she felt probably entitled to compensation, even if she was not subjected to medical experiments. Certainly she had health issues, as it turns out from her son's letter, which he wrote to Nués in 1971. In the near past, I found documents among the inheritance of my late mother, which proved that she had been deported to Auschwitz in 1944 as a Jew, and that she had been in touch with you concerning her compensation claim. At the time of my mother's death, I was a minor, therefore I did not know about the above-mentioned facts. I asked the comrades to inform me as the only successor of the deceased about the potential developments and the conclusion of the case. So Ilona probably never received any compensation, even though she died at the age of 47, so there was definitely some kind of health damage caused. And
please continue.
Yeah?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Okay, I will be very quick. So the last case is that of Mrs. Martin S., who applied for compensation in 1962. And she says in her testimony, I was deported from Monor on the 9th of June 1944, together with my 14-year-old son, who was murdered in the gas chamber. Not much after we arrived in Auschwitz during a Zählerpass, 40-50 individuals were separated where I was included, and they took us to the revier where we got injections to various places. I got one in my womb whose result was that unfortunately I could not have children anymore. According to her medical certificate, she was treated immediately upon her arrival back home, and she had various symptoms as well, like bellyache, and her menstruation did not return. She got hormonal treatment for 2 years. She got married in 1947, but she could not conceive, even despite the hormonal treatments. And according to 1966 medical certificate, I quote, her infertility is by all means interrelated with the experiments endured during the deportation. From her questionnaire, it turns out that her husband died when their son was 4 years old, and she got married again, but the second husband died in military labor service, and during the Holocaust, she lost all of her family. And I quote again from her testimony, being separated from my son was such a grief that nothing else interested me afterwards. Of course, only having a new child could have made up for losing her only son, which she stresses, like my only desire was a child in order to be compensated somehow for my perished son. Unfortunately, I could not have a child anymore. And there was another tragedy in her life. In 1960, my womb was taken out. Otherwise, due to all the traumas, I have a constant high blood pressure and my nerves were ruined. Thus, I live on sedatives. So this is a very typical life to sterilized woman. She has to face that her family was exterminated, her valuables were stolen or redistributed due to her health issues. She could not have a job, and her remaining relatives had to help her. And she was kind of a double outcast from society because she could not pursue a career, and her private life was also problematic. She could not have a child. In 1967, she received 35,000 marks. Of course, this did not bring her son back. And now I come to my conclusions. So we see that the Holocaust can be perceived as a gendered process when it comes to these medical experiments. And the sources produce the compensation process are invaluable for this because they demonstrate both the humiliating circumstances, the sexual violence during the Holocaust, and the difficulties women faced after the war. And they were not only targeted as Jews, but also as women who were biologically capable of bearing children. So this is a kind of dual victimhood. The sterilization deprived these women from one of their fundamental functions, as Ellen Ben Safer emphasizes, because even after the war, they remained infertile and they had a psychological trauma as well. And I think these compensation files also highlight the drawbacks of compensation, because these claims have an overtone as if the claimants try to extract money out of Germany. And the German authorities could decide whether to give compensation, whether the women were honest and they told the truth, and the survivors had to prove that they actually suffered these damages. However, all in all, the compensation was a symbolic gesture toward the survivors, and for many of them, this financial help meant that they could finally treat their health issues. Thank you for your attention, and sorry for being